Welcome, lovers of contemporary philosophy. It is good to be with you in this segment today. This segment is very exciting to me because after a long series thinking about the overall trajectory of phenomenology from Husserl up to the present, we want to think about this very Catholic synthesis of methodology between phenomenology on one hand and classic metaphysics on the other. That these two approaches in philosophy, these two methods can speak to each other for a great philosophical synthesis, best thinking toward the whole. So I have several excerpts on hand this morning out in front of me, and I'm going to begin with some excerpts of Karol Wojtyla, become Pope St. John Paul II, and proceed to some excerpts of St. Edith Stein, and then share some things of my own recent work, trying to build on this methodological synthesis that I call dialectical methodology, and dialectical phenomenology, also from the standpoint of phenomenology. So let's begin with an excerpt here from the collection of essays of Karol Wojtyla called Person and Community. This is chapter 15 of a 1975 essay entitled Subjectivity and the Irreducible in the Human Being. So in this essay, it's very clear that Wojtyla is trying to think of what he calls the objectivity of subjectivity. That these classic divides and these he calls antitheses in philosophy, for example, antinomies, he said, antinomies. On the one hand, objectivity, on the other, subjectivity. On the one hand, objectivism, on the other hand, subjectivism. On the one hand, realism, on the other hand, idealism. He says this is becoming more of a superficial demarcation, dividing up this unified whole into what seem to be antinomous parts. But rather, he says, to get at the unity of being, in metaphysical terms, or the unity of givenness in phenomenological terms, we have to bring these two worlds together of metaphysics and phenomenology. So in this essay, he's trying to point in very briefly to what he considers to be the irreducible in the human being, or in other words, the personhood of the human being, which implies the incommunicability, the fundamental uniqueness of every person, and this inner life world of the person that is showcased in experience, in lived experience. The German word of phenomenology is Erlebnis. And on page 210 of this essay, Wojtyla talks about the importance of phenomenological analysis to overcome the metaphysical reduction of the person. For all the work metaphysics can do, in some ways, it reduces the irreducible of personhood. He mentions Husserl's epoche, that bracketing of the natural attitude, which includes the bracketing of the existence or reality of the conscious subject as a purely objective being. And he says he's convinced that this line of demarcation between the subjectivistic or idealistic and, on the other hand, the objectivistic, realistic views in anthropology and ethics must break down, and is in fact breaking down on the basis of the experience of the human being, on the basis of the experience of the human being. So he's giving a lot of credence to the method of phenomenology and how it is able to perform this descriptive analysis of common lived experience. And so this is what we have at our disposal today, this new methodology that fills out what is lacking in metaphysics, while metaphysics continues to fill out what is lacking in these more contemporary approaches to things, especially in this case, phenomenology. He goes on to say, without the phenomenological analysis in the realm of that assumed subject, pure consciousness. So phenomenology is this method that describes the spiritual activity of pure conscious life of the person and all that gives itself, all these phenomena that give themselves to this pure conscious life. So with phenomenology, we can no longer go on treating the human being exclusively as an objective being, but we must somehow treat the human being as a subject in the dimension in which the specifically human subjectivity of the human being is determined by consciousness. So the science of consciousness, science of conscious life, that beginning with Husserl is the method of phenomenology, getting toward an analysis of this personal, irreducible human subjectivity that comes to surface in our description of lived experience and all the dynamism happening there. So moving to page 215 in this essay into 216, Wojtyla writes that this irreducible in the human signifies that which is essentially incapable of reduction, that which cannot be reduced but can only be disclosed or revealed, not in a once and for all way, but in a constant way. Again, always this newness of the self-revelation of the mystery of the person, this mystery that continues into eternity because it has its basis in eternity in the trinity of the personhood of God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So to be in God's image and likeness in a phenomenological sense is to be a person with all of this lived dynamism and an unending, ultimately unfathomable self-disclosure of givenness of the person. Going on, the method of phenomenological analysis allows us to pause at lived experience as the irreducible. Really like how he says that. Phenomenology allows us to pause at the lived experience through a gathering up of these various self-given phenomena in memory, but they're presented ever anew in the phenomenological analysis. And so when we pause, we don't stagnate, but we open up this dynamic revelation of givenness, of what is irreducible in the human, in this case thinking about anthropology. He goes on to say this method, phenomenology, is not just a descriptive cataloging of individual phenomena, but when we pause at the lived experience of the irreducible, we attempt to permeate cognitively the whole essence of this experience. The whole, we attempt to permeate cognitively the whole essence of this experience. We thus apprehend both the essentially subjective structure of lived experience and its structural relation to the subjectivity of the human being. Phenomenological analysis thus contributes to trans-phenomenal understanding. It also contributes to a disclosure of the richness proper to human existence in the whole complex compositum humanum, the whole complex of the composite psychosomatic human person. So in this essay, he's talking about how metaphysics and phenomenology should go together as an intertwined methodology for today, especially when approaching such realities as the human being, the human person. This Wojtyla continues in, here's some excerpts from his work called Theology of the Body. Audiences 3 and 4 we're looking at together. And this methodology is key for his theology of the body. Early on, as we read with him, he envisions this not dualistic methodology, but a complementary methodology of metaphysics and phenomenology. So to look at some of these excerpts here in Theology of the Body, you see who he's quoting in section 3 or audience 3, another phenomenologist we've studied, Paul Ricoeur, trying to get at the power of metaphor within these Genesis narratives of primordial history of humanity. And he finds Paul Ricoeur and another guy who's rather phenomenological, Moshe Eliade, who taught at University of Chicago as well in the early 20th century, mid-20th century, as to be very helpful to unpack this very deep, rich, symbolic givenness of the Genesis narratives. Also another figure here, Paul Tillich. All these guys taught at University of Chicago. And then, so Eliade, Tillich, Ricoeur, David Tracy, who I feature in my book, which we're reading that excerpt this week, and Jean-Luc Marion. All these guys taught at University of Chicago, and it's a kind of ongoing phenomenological school there. And I had the privilege of studying there back in 2006 to 2011 while I was attending Loyola University of Chicago, working on my PhD studies in philosophical theology. So this excerpt at the end here of Theology of the Body, audience 4, section 4, Wojtyla, he writes this before becoming Pope in late 1978, but he says after becoming Pope, he lets this Theology of the Body be the centerpiece of his Wednesday catechetical Wednesday catechetical audiences. So he finds this very important for, I think, around the time of 4 years. Pope St. John Paul II would feature this Theology of the Body as his primary catechetical project. So he sees this as very important for us today. It's a very rich text, but here's just one excerpt, getting at the methodology in force in this work, page 145, audience 4, section 4. When in the context of the theology of bodily man substantially delineated in this way, we reflect about the method of further analyses of the revelation of the beginning, the primordial historical beginning of man, in which the appeal to the first chapters of Genesis is essential. We must immediately turn our attention to a factor that is particularly important for theological interpretation. Important because it consists in the relation between revelation, divine revelation, and experience. In the interpretation of the revelation about man, and above all about the body, we must, for understandable reasons, appeal to experience, because bodily man is perceived by us, above all, in experience. This is what the method of phenomenology helps us to unlock. God's revelation in a sacramental cosmos, divine revelation revealed in and through the self-revelation of the anthropos, the human, as male and female, to think back to Genesis chapter 1, verse 27, to be made in the divine image is to be made as male and female, it includes this essential sexual constitution of being that expresses the common universal human vocation to self-donation, one for the other. This call to personal communion, as St. John Paul II calls it, a call to this communio personarum, this communion of persons, as human beings ultimately oriented toward the communion of saints. Further on, yet in the light of the same introductory considerations, we must reach the conviction that in this case, our experience in some way is a legitimate means for theological interpretation, and that in a certain sense it is an indispensable point of reference to which we must appeal in the interpretation of the beginning. So the science of experience, the science of subjectivity, is the work of phenomenology in relation to that science of objectivity and the objective categorization of beings, that is classic metaphysics. So both of these things together help us to get at the fullness of the human being, the human person, and so many other realities besides. Okay, so here we are up to this point. I want to turn attention to the end of this book of Mind Phenomenology, a basic introduction in the light of Jesus Christ. At the very end, I suggest some of the insufficiency of phenomenology by itself, and which gave rise to this other book I wrote called Metaphysics. So I wrote these two books together to go together to be kind of companion volumes, in a sense complementary to one another. Because again, the thing is, in these philosophical circles today, those who are into phenomenology tend to be dismissive of metaphysics, saying it's run its course, it has no more place. This God of metaphysics, to say with Nietzsche, is dead. This Aristotelianism, this scholasticism is defunct. And those who are really into, say, Neotomism, or this classic metaphysics tend to have an allergic reaction to phenomenology. This brings in all of these worlds unmanageable by the categories of metaphysics, and it seems a kind of dangerous, convoluted, disrupting the nice, neat and tidy clarity of metaphysics. So metaphysicians tend to not be fans of phenomenology. But what we see in figures like St. John Paul II, St. Edith Stein, are a bringing together of these two philosophical worlds. And so I think it's important to see this development in recent philosophy, especially Catholic philosophy, and to see where other avenues we can go with this dialectical methodology. So I want to just read some toward the end of the phenomenology book, and connect this to the Wojtyla excerpts, and then connect it finally to a short Stein excerpt, and then an excerpt of maybe a couple excerpts from a couple other of my books. Let's see how much time we have. Not to go too long. Okay, so at the very end, I suggest this concerning the method of phenomenology. In the context of postmodernity, many philosophers, and not a few theologians, have cashed out in the directions of relativism and nihilism as a reaction to the equally nefarious error of fundamentalism. You see this a lot in contemporary philosophy, where people become very suspicious of doctrine, like church doctrine, for example, and they think they know better than the magisterium of the church, and they always want to challenge these various doctrines of the church. And they do this because for a bunch of different reasons. But one thing is some of these thinkers, they're very on guard against anything that smacks of fundamentalism. And so if you pull toward the other extreme away from fundamentalism, you move toward relativism. And so we want to think about this, that extremes meet. And that's what I argue early on in this other book called Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist. But to read on here, all reductionisms meet in the same ballpark in which there is no ball to pitch and no bat with which to hit. It's not very exciting. This world of reductionism, whatever form it takes, and especially when extremes meet, it's a very much a stagnation of thought. It's a closure of questions. Without naming names, suffice it to say that those who claim church doctrine as allergen misplace the origin of their sneeze. Perhaps ontotheology is not the root of all intellectual evil after all. Perhaps Dominicans, who I'm thinking here represent more the metaphysical tradition, and Carmelites, perhaps in a fun way as being a Carmelite, maybe it's a more phenomenological approach to things, although very much informed by metaphysics, yes, of course. But I'm thinking of the mystical experiences. Perhaps Dominicans and Carmelites, for instance, still have something to say to one another today. If truth is what we are after, then we must remain open to all of its varied channels of revelation. The irony of relativism is that it poses as open to all save for the absolute, and it does so absolutely. The irony of nihilism is that it claims to have found something only to have gotten lost in the process. What it has found is the alleged possibility of impossibility, and in its hubris vacates the possibility of the impossibility of impossibility, namely the possibility of letting itself be found by another, namely divine revelation, which will include, for Catholic belief, all of the magisterial doctrines, dogmas of the Church. The irony of fundamentalism on the other side of the spectrum is that it claims to hold a monopoly on truth while without admitting, in humility, its legion blind spots and unwarranted reductionisms. Yes, indeed, if left to ourselves, we perish, and one moral compass is as good as the next. Yes, indeed, if we pretend that we are gods and that there are many others, we drift again into the pool of Narcissus and bite into the toxic fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Yes, indeed, if truth does not circulate through the play of conversation and the conflict of interpretations, it withers up like a fig tree that bears no figs. However, if we insist on our identity as seekers of truth, and that is the key, we may discover, because it has been shown and told to us, that truth has a face and the personal name, Jesus. So good, comprehensive phenomenology takes us to this place of encounter in which we receive the giving intuition that the logos of philosophy is the logos of theology. To quote that intuition of St. Justin the Martyr. Yet phenomenology lies remiss in its inability to make a definitive judgment. This is the weakness of phenomenology. Or even to submit its findings to a final verdict that phenomenology itself cannot give. Phenomenology gathers up all these fragments of experience, but then as far as passing a judgment as to not only what is meaningful, which phenomenology is very good at this, but what is ultimately true in a metaphysical sense, in an ontological sense. Phenomenology itself doesn't have the capacity, the resources to make this judgment, this definitive judgment. This has to be passed to metaphysics. Perhaps phenomenology is afraid that this conclusive move of its humility will disqualify its scientific genius, its method as a rigorous science, that it will stop play and arrest its contemplative business of description. Phenomenology resists yielding to a method not its own and granting it the last word, because the good faith of phenomenology renounces the possibility of an end. It perpetually resists the act of judgment as to the absolute truth or falsehood of a phenomenon. As alluded to earlier in the book, the greatest strength of phenomenology is, at the same time, its greatest weakness. Indecision. Suspension of judgment indefinitely. The phenomenology by itself is unable to render a resolute decision because it lacks the necessary methodological apparatus to do so. It needs something else from somewhere else to serve the pursuit of truth all the way, to go the distance of seeking the truth, even though what phenomenology loves is the givenness of the distance itself. The play of truth self-revelation and a description of this. Phenomenology is at home here. Even all the while suspending this definitive final verdict as to the metaphysical truth of things. So paradoxically, in the end, phenomenology needs metaphysics. And you can read the rest there. I put forth only a handful of thinkers that I find bringing together phenomenology and metaphysics in the 20th century. Edith Stein, Karol Wojtyla, Hedwig Conrad Martius, who was a contemporary and good friend of Edith Stein. None of her major works are translated into English yet. They're on German. A couple other German writers, Erich Shavara, Jesuit, Karl Rahner, another Jesuit, Hans Urs von Balthasar, former Jesuit. Let's see, a common theme. Paul Ricoeur, a Reformed Christian philosopher. So these different thinkers have brought the two methods together, and I call it an approach of twinning to refer to this dialectical proximity of the methods, as twinning can imply both separation and joining together. So not a synthesis of metaphenomenology or phenomena metaphysics, but each method must remain its own, yet they're called together to converse and to interact. So iron sharpens iron, so one method sharpens the other. That's the idea. That's the idea with what we're getting at with these two methods combined. What they have in common is what St. Edith Stein mentions in her dialogue between Husserl and Aquinas on page 7 of the English edition. She talks about philosophia perennis, perennial philosophy, which goes back to classic metaphysics. Perennial philosophy, she says on the lips of St. Thomas in this dialogue between St. Thomas and Husserl, philosophia perennis means the spirit of genuine philosophy alive in every true philosopher, in anyone who cannot resist an inner need to search out the logos of this world, its ratio. The born philosopher, the true philosopher indeed must be born as a philosopher, brings this spirit with him into the world as potency. And this potency becomes actualized when he meets a mature philosopher, a teacher. And she goes on to talk about St. Thomas admitting that Aristotle, as well as Plato and St. Augustine, were some of his primary teachers. Whereas for Husserl, some of his primary teachers were Descartes, Hume, and Brentano, Franz Brentano, inspiring Husserl to embark on this rigorous science and a return to the things themselves, a closing of the gap between the noumenon and the phenomenon. St. Thomas concludes this section to say, again, imaginatively, this is Edith Stein writing, we are both convinced, Husserl and St. Thomas, that a logos is the force behind all that is, and that our understanding can uncover step by step, first one aspect of this logos, then another, and so on, as long as it moves ahead in accordance with the principle of the most stringent intellectual honor. So that's a great quote from St. Edith Stein's work, thinking about how metaphysics and phenomenology come together as represented by St. Thomas and Edmund Husserl. I would also refer you, I'm not going to read from the excerpt just for the sake of time, but this book of mine on the work of St. Edith Stein called Human and Divine Being, a study on the theological anthropology of Edith Stein. Pages in the introduction, Roman numeral 23 and following, I talk about the distinctiveness of phenomenology and metaphysics and how they can work together methodologically. I also give a presentation of the method of phenomenology more extensively in the beginning of this book, Dialectical Anatomy of the Eucharist. And this week we're reading the last part of this book, therefore totally out of context, but just you get a sense of how, the rigor of bringing together metaphysics and phenomenology, what in chapter, the last chapter of this book is calling Transcendental Reflection, chapter 6, from the work of David Tracy on in his book Blessed Rage for Order, thinking about how transcendental reflection or a metaphysical moment should follow this phenomenological analysis for the most complete philosophical and then theological approach. So if I were to just make a couple quotes from this book to round out this video segment this morning, thank you for bearing with me. There's so much more to be said always. So many good truths, so little time to discuss them, to think about them. As Jesus says to his disciples in the Gospel of John, I have so many more things to tell you, but you cannot bear them now. Or at least this video can't bear them now, time cannot bear them now. But this is just trying to get at what I see as the apogee, the zenith, the culminating point of the method of phenomenology so far, through all these various layers of Husserl's transcendental phenomenology, Heidegger's existential phenomenology, Gadamer and Ricoeur's hermeneutic phenomenology, Merleau-Ponty and Marion's carnal phenomenology, Levinas's ethical phenomenology, and now this dialectical phenomenology that will put itself in conversation with metaphysics. This I see is genuinely Catholic again to think with St. John Paul II, where he writes in Fides et Ratio, his encyclical on contemporary philosophy. Metaphysics is absolutely necessary for any Catholic philosophy worthy of the name. Phenomenology serves to enhance the scope of Catholic philosophy in huge ways, and we want to follow these recent saints and these great philosophers and theologians, and we want to emulate what they're doing, I think, as we move into this 21st century. So page 222 of this book, just a short quote to conclude. We're doing phenomenology. Judgment can be suspended only for so long. Making phenomenological claims in the name of possibility can be sustained only for so long. In the end, one must decide. One must judge for oneself, one must interpret, one must become a witness and testify to the truth. We all have to take the witness stand, not just to describe what happened, but to hazard a judgment, a truth claim, a synthesis of meaning and meaningfulness in the end. And that is the work of metaphysics. Metaphysics is really what goes before and behind all rigorous phenomenological analyses. Because, as I say later, focusing on what I call the Logos principle that we see coming through, especially in metaphysics, all the while work in phenomenology, at work in phenomenology. But the Logos principle, on page 226, I say, is the rule of the cosmos itself. It is the meaning-making principle inscribed in the whole of the cosmic order, wherein realities give themselves as meaningful, to be interpreted as meaningful, and take on meaning from human subjective assignment and denomination. But first, it gives. So if we're talking about meaning, meaning is first of all what is discovered, and then what is denominated, interpreted, etc. Even Immanuel Kant says we can't imagine anything whose parts we didn't in some way already experience, weren't already given to us in experience. Try to imagine something you never experienced. Even if you synthesize some various experiences, a flying spaghetti monster, you've experienced flight, spaghetti, some images of monsters, so you imagine some figure in your mind, the flying spaghetti monster, and it's a synthesis of already lived experiences. So first is what gives itself in experience, and that is what we build all our interpretations on. And so this is a really pushes against some of these ideas in existentialism, as if we create meaning, or in structuralism, in Barthes and Saussure, these kind of ideas where they're suggesting that meaning is arbitrary and it's self-made. But phenomenology and metaphysics both are getting at the fact of the matter that in the beginning, it gives. Phenomenologically speaking, or metaphysically speaking, in the beginning, being, act, cause. Even more, it is according to the Logos principle that this or that meaning is judged to be true, that is, adequate to experience. Without the notion of a Logos principle, the prospect of a public and fundamental theology would be absurd. It would be in the land of pure relativism without a Logos principle that anchors all meaning according to a common standard of meaning making and judgment. The condition of possibility for meaning making is what I'm calling this Logos principle. In fact, the prospect of any theology or any logi, based on the term logos in Greek, would be absurd. Absurd insofar as logically absurd. So much more could be said here, but in this book, ultimately, if you got a chance to read most of this chapter, if not all of it, I'm trying to argue with this contemporary approach of a blend of metaphysics and phenomenology that the Eucharist is not only incredibly meaningful in this range of human experiences, its hermeneutics of gift and everything else, but that it is true. I'm staking a truth claim in a postmodern world, trying to utilize the best resources of the old and the new in Catholic philosophy and theology. So I argue that the Eucharist is true in as much as the paradigmatic is the real, to quote David Tracy. And I think it's a very powerful concept in our time. That what is most convincing is what is most paradigmatic. And what is most paradigmatic is rooted in the Logos principle of the universe, on display throughout the whole of creation. Okay, so we've covered some different territories today. Again, thank you for bearing with me. I hope you're doing well. And I look forward to being with you again sometime soon in a new video. Coming up will be some reflection on some of the more darker experiences in contemporary philosophy in certain ways, or at least those philosophical approaches that dare to linger in the shadows of some things. So deconstruction, some various contextual philosophies, and psychoanalysis, and all these things going on up to the present. But we don't want to depart from what we've talked about here in metaphysics and phenomenology coming together, and not forget about all this that's been built up the past several weeks through this course, through this study, as we think along with some very not metaphysically based philosophers. Neither are they very phenomenologically based, as the method really crystallizes over time. So this will be interesting weeks ahead. Thanks so much. Pray you are well. See you soon.